She could not read. She could not write her own name. And when they put a forged document in front of a judge to take her children, she was the only person in that courtroom who knew it was a lie, because she had spent an entire winter learning the handwriting of a dead man she still loved. This is her story. The sky was bruised with early dusk, a muddy lavender that pressed low over the prairie, heavy and unforgiving, the way winter settles into a place and refuses to leave. Wind cut across the empty street of Elkhorn, dry and sharp as a blade, and rattled the rusted sign hanging above Pruitt's Mercantile. December 1878. The last light of day fell without ceremony, without promise. Snow had not yet come, but the cold had already settled deep in the earth, waiting in the frozen ground the way grief waits in the bones of someone who has known too much of it. Beside the store's front porch, beneath the overhang where freight was usually stacked, two children lay curled on a thin wool blanket. Their backs were pressed together like pups in a nest, small bodies trembling in a rhythm that had nothing to do with dreaming. The girl was no more than 6. Her coat was too small, buttoned wrong, and her face was hidden in the crook of her brother's arm. Her name was Nell, though no one on that street knew it yet. The boy looked older, 8, perhaps 9, thin as fence wire with bruised eyes and a raw nose that had been running for days. His name was Elijah. He had not slept well in weeks, but he held his sister close with the kind of instinct that comes not from being taught, but from being the only one left to do it. They did not stir when the door of the Mercantile creaked open. Inside the store, a woman stood near the back wall, motionless. Her name was Clara Whitfield, and she was holding a jar of lard she had not paid for. Her hands trembled from more than cold. One of her boots had a hole at the toe, patched with wire, and a strip of cloth that had soaked through hours ago. Her skirt hem was stiff with dust from the road, and the shawl over her shoulders was thin enough to see through. She had not slept in 2 nights, not since she arrived in Elkhorn. Margaret Pruitt, the woman behind the counter, had already told her no. No credit, not after the debts her husband had left behind, not without proof of who she was or where she belonged. Clara had thanked her and stepped away from the counter, with her head high, her face betraying nothing. But now she stood frozen in the dim corner, her fingers curled around the ball, unsure whether she would set it back on the shelf or slip it inside her coat and walk out. 8 months ago, her husband Henry had been alive, strong enough to split a cord of wood before breakfast, quick enough with a smile that she sometimes forgot how tired she was. Then the fever came. Typhoid. It took him in 10 days. After the funeral, men she had never met arrived at her door with papers, contracts, debts. She could not read them. Henry had handled all the documents, every transaction, every signature. She had never learned her letters, not one. And because she could not read, she could not argue. They took the wagon first, then the tools, then the horse, then the cabin itself. A woman at the refugee camp outside of Springfield had read her a small notice torn from a newspaper. Rancher, 34 years old, seeks wife to maintain homestead. Montana territory. Send letter to Elkhorn, Montana. The woman had written Clara's reply for her. But in that letter, Clara had said nothing about the children. Not because she wanted to deceive anyone, because she was afraid. Afraid that no man alive would accept a widow dragging 2 extra miles behind her like stones tied to a rope. 3 weeks of walking, hitching rides on freight wagons, sleeping under bridges with Elijah and Nell pressed against her like 2 heartbeats she refused to let stop. And when she finally reached Elkhorn, when she stood at the edge of town and looked at the small buildings scattered along the frozen street, she could not bring herself to knock on a stranger's door. Not with 2 children he did not know existed. So she had placed them beneath the Mercantile's overhang, told Elijah to hold his sister, and gone inside. Now she stood with stolen lard in her hands and shame burning through her chest. The front door of the store opened again. Edna Hargrove stepped back inside from the porch, brushing cold from her sleeves. She was 55 years old, the wife of Elkhorn's only preacher, and she carried herself with the rigid authority of a woman who believed God had personally appointed her to judge everyone else's business. Her eyes swept across Clara with open disdain, lingering on the patched boots, the fraying shawl, the jar clutched too tightly. Then Edna turned toward Margaret behind the counter. "There are 2 filthy children sleeping on your porch, Margaret." Her voice was loud enough for Clara to hear. Deliberately so. "They belong to this woman, I assume." Margaret said nothing, her lips pressed thin. Edna looked back at Clara. "What exactly did you bring them here for? To beg or to trick some kind-hearted fool into feeding you. Clara's throat locked. She could feel the blood rising to her face, hot and stinging. But she did not lower her eyes. She did not answer either. She simply held her ground jaw, set the jar motionless in her hands. Edna's gaze narrowed. She turned to Margaret again. You should send for Sheriff Briggs, a woman with no husband, no home, leaving children outside in the cold. That is neglect, plain and simple. Outside, one of the children began to cough. The sound was dry and deep, scraping up from small lungs that had been fighting the cold for too long. It came through the walls of the store like a fist against a door. The front door opened a third time. The wind came with it, and a man stepped inside. Tall, broad across the shoulders. His hat pulled low against the cold, and snow dust clung to his coat in a thin white film. He paused as his eyes adjusted to the dimness, then walked to the counter without noticing Clara at first. He set down a small sack of feed and a tin of coffee. His movements were unhurried, deliberate, the way a man moves when he has lived alone long enough that everything becomes routine. His name was Caleb Drummond. He was 35 years old. He owned a ranch 5 miles east of Elkhorn, past the dry creek bed, and a rusted wire fence that sagged like tired shoulders. He had not spoken more than a dozen words to anyone in town in the past month. That was not unusual. His eyes drifted past the shelves, past Margaret, past Edna, and found the back window. Through the frost on the glass, he could see the porch. 2 small shapes huddled in the shadows, breath clouding in short, desperate bursts. The coughing came again. Caleb turned his head, looked at Clara, then back through the window. His jaw tightened. They can't sleep out there, he said. His voice was not harsh, not angry, just flat, the way someone might observe that the river was rising or the fence line was down. Edna stepped forward. That is a matter for the sheriff, Mr. Drummond. You cannot simply collect other people's children off the street. Caleb did not look at her. He walked past Clara, past the shelves, and pushed through the front door. The cold hit him full in the face, but he did not hesitate. He crouched beside the boy first. Gently, one hand beneath the small knees, the other behind the narrow back. Elijah stirred, coughed once, then sagged against the man's chest, as if his body had been waiting for permission to stop fighting. Caleb came back for the girl. Nell whimpered and clutched the blanket, her eyes half open, dull with exhaustion. But the man murmured something low, so quiet even Clara could not hear it from the doorway, and the girl let go. He lifted her with one arm, the blanket trailing behind like a ragged wing. Inside, Edna's face had gone red. You are making a mistake, Mr. Drummond. Caleb turned. He looked at her the way a man looks at a fence post. Something in the way, but not worth the trouble of argument. They are children, he said, cold ones. Then he looked at Clara. Her cheeks were blotched red. From shame or cold, he could not tell. Maybe both. You coming or not? She stared at the floor. He adjusted Nell in his arms, nodded once, and walked out without waiting for an answer. She followed. The jar of lard stayed on the shelf. If you have ever driven through Montana in December, you know the sound of hooves on frozen earth. A muffled rhythm, steady and low, like a heartbeat heard through a wall. That was the only sound between them as they rode through the darkness. Clara sat beside Caleb on the bench of his small wagon, her hands gripping her shawl so tightly that her knuckles showed white against the wool. Behind them in the covered bed of the wagon, the children lay wrapped in a thick coat Caleb had pulled from beneath the seat. He had tucked Nell's hand into Elijah's before stepping back, saying nothing. The moon was rising now, pale and heavy, casting long shadows across the fields. The land stretched flat and colorless in every direction, broken only by the dark line of fence posts leaning at tired angles against the horizon. You have a name, he asked, eyes on the road. Clara. You have a place. She looked away. Not anymore. He nodded once. You do now. That was all. The rest of the ride passed in silence. In the wagon behind them, the children had stopped coughing. His ranch appeared out of the dark with no warning. A squat silhouette against the hill roof, patched in places, with tin smoke just beginning to thread from the chimney where coals had been banked before he left for town. A single light burned in the window, yellow and steady, the kind of light that looks warm even from a distance. He did not say much as he carried the children inside. Elijah woke enough to protest, a sharp word half formed on cracked lips, but Caleb hushed him gently and carried him over the threshold like the boy weighed nothing at all. Nell was asleep again, her head lolled against his chest, one small fist tangled in his coat. Clara followed with slow, uncertain steps. She had not been inside a house like this since before Henry's illness, before the fever had taken everything. The walls were bare but clean. A pot simmered low on the stove, giving off the smell of salt meat and beans. A pile of kindling was stacked near the hearth. The table was solid pine, scarred by years of use, and the chairs did not match. He laid the children on a rope bed in the corner and pulled a thick quilt over both of them. "They'll be warm now," he said. Clara nodded but said nothing. "Sit if you want. Food's still hot." Her stomach twisted at the smell. She had not eaten since the day before last, but something in her resisted. Pride. Or fear. Maybe both. She stood frozen until he turned back and set a bowl down on the table, not asking again. He sat across from her but did not eat, just watched the fire. The silence between them was thick but not heavy. It had the weight of something waiting to be understood. On the shelf above his bed, Clara noticed 4 books. Old and worn. Cracked spines. Not the kind of thing you expected from a rancher who lived this far from town. And beside the books, a small picture frame turned face down. She noticed it but did not ask. Finally, he spoke. "Your man's gone." She hesitated, then gave a single nod. "Typhoid. Took him fast." Her voice cracked like dry wood. "Afterward, they said we owed more than we ever did. I couldn't read the papers. They came for the wagon, the tools, the horse. Took the cabin next. And no one stepped in." She let out a bitter breath. "Folks pray. They don't help." He nodded as if he already knew that. "Saw too many go cold, and not one soul blink," he said quietly. "Decided I'd stop blinking too." He stood and moved toward the back room. "You take my bed for now. I'll sleep near the fire. Water's in the basin." She watched him disappear down the short hallway. Her breath was shallow in her chest. The children stirred beneath the quilt, Elijah pulling it tighter around them both. She looked at them. Her boy. Her girl. Faces softened in sleep color, already returning to their cheeks from the warmth of the stove. Then she looked at the empty bowl, the flames dancing across the rough-hewn walls, the hallway where he had gone, and the picture frame turned face down on its shelf. She did not trust it. Not yet. Not the food, not the bed, not the man. But for the first time in weeks, she believed they might live through winter. The next morning came gray and windless, a stillness that felt almost sacred after so much cold and motion. Frost had etched the windows in delicate veins, and the world outside was pale and brittle, like something that might shatter beneath a single footstep. Clara rose early, before the man stirred, before the children had begun to rustle under the quilt. She washed her face in the basin, biting back a gasp at the cold, then moved to the hearth and stoked the embers until the fire caught again. She found flour in a tin lard in a crock and enough sense in her fingers to make flatbread the way her mother once had. By the time Caleb came in from checking the animals, the smell of it filled the house. He paused in the doorway, took off his gloves, watched her quietly. She worked without looking up, hands dusted with flour, face still flushed from the heat of the fire. "Smells good," he said. She nodded. "It'll hold you." He stepped forward. "Don't have to do that." She did look up then, steady, calm, a look that said she knew exactly what she was doing and why. "I do," she said, "if I'm to be here." He did not argue. They ate in silence again, but something had shifted in the air between them. It was easier now, shaped less by caution and more by a tired, unspoken understanding that neither of them was in a position to pretend. After breakfast, he saddled the horse and pointed toward the barn. "Come, I'll show you the stock." She hesitated, glancing at the children. "They'll sleep another hour yet," he said. Outside, the world was hushed beneath frost. The fields stretched empty and colorless brittle weeds poking through hard ground. The barn stood weathered but sound, the wood silvered with age, the latch stubborn but solid. Inside it smelled of hay, of old leather, of animals alive and breathing. 2 cows, 3 goats, a mule in the far stall. Clara took it in quietly. Her hand found the pitchfork without being told. She cleaned the stalls without complaint. He did not correct her. He did not need to. "You know the work," he said after a while. "I know what's needed." He nodded. "That's better than most." That afternoon, Caleb took his coat from the peg near the door to mend a torn seam along the shoulder. Something fell from the pocket, a crumpled piece of newspaper folded small and soft from being carried too long. He did not mean to read it. He was reaching for needle and thread. But his eye caught the words before his hand caught the paper. Rancher 34 seeks wife to maintain homestead. Montana Territory, his own advertisement, the one he had placed 4 months ago in a Denver paper because Judge Harlan Crawford had warned him that a single man with no family could face questions about his homestead claim. A man alone on that much land, the judge had said. They'll say you can't sustain it. Get a wife or risk losing what you've built. Caleb stood very still. He looked at Clara across the room. She was scrubbing the pot, her back to him, her shoulders tight the way they always were, as if she were bracing for something. He folded the paper and slipped it back into her coat pocket. He said nothing. But that evening, after the children had fallen asleep and the fire had burned low to embers, he sat outside on the porch and spoke without turning to face her. You came here because of the advertisement. It was not a question. Clara stood in the doorway behind him, arms crossed against the cold. Silence stretched between them like a held breath. Yes. You didn't say you had children. No. Her voice carried the kind of honesty that comes when a person has nothing left to protect except the truth. Because no one wants a widow dragging 2 extra mouths. Caleb stared out across the dark field. They're not extra. Clara swallowed. Do you want me to leave? He was quiet for so long, she thought he would not answer. The wind moved through the grass, low and cold. Then he said something she did not expect. I placed that advertisement because Judge Crawford told me if I didn't prove I had a family, they'd question my right to the homestead. A man alone on land this size, they said I wasn't fit to maintain it. He paused. I didn't post it because I wanted a wife. I posted it because I was about to lose everything. Clara looked at him. Moonlight on his weathered face, his calloused hands resting on his knees. The quiet weight of a man who had carried something heavy for a very long time. So you didn't choose this either, she said. No, but I'm choosing it now. The words hung between them, suspended in the freezing air, like breath made visible. Neither moved, neither spoke again. But when Clara stepped back inside, she did not close the door all the way. And Caleb did not ask why. What happened next changed nothing on the surface, but changed everything underneath. Not with speed, but with the slow accumulation of small things. The way trust is not built in a single moment, but in the steady repetition of moments where harm could be done and is not. Days shaped themselves around work. Clara rose before dawn and labored until dusk. She chopped wood, mended clothing, salted what little meat they had. The movements came back to her body the way water finds its old path through stone. Caleb did not hover, but sometimes she would look up and find him watching. Not with suspicion, with something closer to recognition. As if he were seeing a skill he had thought was his alone. She watched him too, not with caution any longer, but with the kind of quiet attention that slips in when your hands are full and your heart does not want company but listens anyway. He moved with the ease of someone accustomed to silence. But in the small things, in the way he poured water for the goats before himself, in the way he cut an apple for Nell and ate only the piece she left behind, Clara saw a man who had known loneliness and loss. The children warmed to him faster than she did. Elijah, cautious at first, began asking questions about the barn, the horse, the land. How deep should fence posts go? Why the mule favored its left leg? Whether the creek would thaw before March. Caleb answered each one without impatience, without condescension, the way a man talks to someone he considers worth the trouble of teaching. Nell took to following him everywhere, her small boots trailing behind his every step, her breath puffing in the cold like a tiny engine. She did not speak much, but she hummed, sometimes soft and tuneless, while she played with scraps of fabric or shells she found in the frozen yard. Caleb never made a fuss about it. He just let her. One evening, as the light faded into that deep winter blue that comes just before full dark, Clara stepped onto the porch and found Caleb sitting with Elijah, showing the boy how to tie a proper knot. His big hands moved slowly, patiently, guiding the boy's thin fingers through the loops. Elijah's face was creased with concentration, his tongue poking out the corner of his mouth. When the knot held, the boy looked up with a grin that made him look for the first time since Clara could remember like a child. Her breath caught in her throat. She could not have said why, exactly. Only that something in the picture before her, the tall man and the thin boy, and the light fading around them, struck a chord she had thought was broken. One morning while mending the strap of a feed sack, Clara glanced again at the shelf above Caleb's bed. The four old books. The picture frame still turned face down. She had told herself not to look. But her hand reached out anyway, and before she could stop herself, she turned the frame over. A woman. Young. Blonde hair light as wheat straw, and a smile that was soft but certain. On the back in careful handwriting, Sarah, 1874. Caleb's voice came from the doorway. My wife. Clara set the frame down quickly. I'm sorry, I shouldn't have. Sarah. He said the name the way you say a prayer you have memorized but never stop meaning. She died giving birth. The baby didn't make it either. He looked past Clara, past the wall, past everything. 3 years ago, Clara placed the frame back where it had been, face down, exactly as she found it. I won't move it. I know. Silence. The fire popped once. My husband wrote me letters before we were married, Clara said quietly. 3 of them, while he was still in Missouri and I was in Illinois. I couldn't read them, but I kept them, because they were all I had left of him. Caleb looked at her then, really looked. And in that look was something neither of them named, but both recognized. The shape of loss. The hollow it leaves behind. The way it makes everything that follows feel borrowed, as though it might be reclaimed without warning. That night, after the children were asleep, Clara sat at the table and said the words she had been carrying for weeks. Can you teach me to read? Caleb studied her face. Read. She nodded, eyes fixed on the table. I never learned. Henry handled all the papers, every contract, every signature. That's why they took everything from us. I couldn't read the debt notices. I didn't know I was being cheated until it was too late. Caleb pulled his chair closer. He took the thinnest book from the shelf, the one with the most worn spine. He opened it to the first page. We'll start here. From that night on, after the fire burned low and the children's breathing slowed to the rhythm of sleep, Clara and Caleb sat at the table with a candle between them. She learned each letter the way a builder lays stones, one at a time, with care and weight. He never corrected her with impatience. She never gave up, even when her eyes blurred with exhaustion. And in the course of those lessons, Clara brought out the only thing she had carried from her old life. 3 letters from Henry, written before their wedding when he was still courting her from across 2 states. She could not read them, but she had kept them folded against her body through every mile of the journey to Montana, pressed between her dress and her skin, because they were the last pieces of him that no one could take. Caleb helped her read them word by word. And as she learned, Clara began to recognize Henry's handwriting the way you recognize a face. The particular curl at the top of his letter H, the way his signature always leaned to the right. The 2 sharp folds in the W of Whitfield that no one else wrote quite the same way. She did not know it yet, but those letters would save her children. Stay with us. Subscribe now and walk this road a while longer. The story of Clara Whitfield is far from over. A week passed, the rhythm of days grew familiar. Morning chores, simple meals, firewood stacked against the wall, and sometimes breaking through the winter quiet like a crack in ice, the sound of children laughing. But the world outside the ranch was not sleeping. Clara went to town with Caleb one cold morning to buy supplies. They walked into Pruitt's Mercantile together, and within the hour, every tongue in Elkhorn was wagging. Edna Hargrove saw them first. She stood on the boardwalk outside the general store, the arms folded, watching Clara the way a hawk watches a mouse crossing open ground. By noon, the whispers had spread through every kitchen and parlor in town. That widow without letters is living with Drummond. No marriage, no ceremony. Brought 2 children nobody has ever seen before. What kind of woman does that? The words reached Clara before she left town. She heard them in the way Margaret Pruitt would not meet her eyes when she set her purchases on the counter. In the way the woman at the feed store pulled her daughter close when Clara walked past. In the tight, mean smiles of 2 women standing outside the church. Margaret Pruitt shook her head as Clara placed coins on the counter. I don't want trouble, Mrs. Whitfield. Clara looked straight at her. Her voice was even and cool. I'm paying with money, Mrs. Pruitt, not with apologies. She turned and walked out, back straight, chin level. Outside, Doc Samuel Harding was crossing the street from the apothecary. He was 60 years old with white hair and a leather bag that looked as worn as his boots. He stopped when he saw Clara. Mrs. Whitfield. He held out a small paper packet. For the little girl's cough. This winter is hard on young lungs. Clara looked at the packet, then at the old man. No one in Elkhorn had offered her anything except judgment. I've known Caleb Drummond 15 years, Doc Harding said. If he brought you to his home, he had his reasons. And they were good ones. He tipped his hat and walked on. It was not much, a packet of medicine and a few quiet words, but Clara held them close the way she held Henry's letters, like evidence that the world was not entirely merciless. But Edna Hargrove was not finished. Over the next several days, the preacher's wife moved through the women of Elkhorn with the efficiency of a general assembling troops. She gathered 4 signatures on a letter addressed to Sheriff Tom Briggs, requesting an investigation into the welfare of 2 minor children residing with an unmarried man of no blood relation. She brought the letter to Margaret Pruitt and asked her to sign as well. Margaret hesitated. She thought of Clara's steady eyes of the coins placed firmly on the counter. Then she thought of Edna standing in her store watching waiting. She signed. Sheriff Briggs came to the ranch on a Tuesday. He was 45 thick through the middle with a mustache that had seen better decades. He dismounted slowly, looked around the property with the careful eyes of a man doing his duty without enthusiasm. The house was warm. The children were fed. Nell was sitting on the floor near the stove playing with a collection of dried seed pods and acorn caps she had gathered from the yard. Elijah was outside with Caleb learning to mend a harness. The boy looked up when the sheriff arrived, his eyes wary but not afraid. Briggs asked Clara a few polite questions. Where she was from, how long she had been in Elkhorn, the nature of her arrangement with Mr. Drummond. Clara answered each one without hesitation and without offering more than was asked. Briggs wrote in a small notebook, then closed it. I don't see a problem here, Mrs. Whitfield, but I'll tell you straight, Mrs. Hargrove won't stop. I know, Clara said. Briggs looked at her a moment longer, then nodded and rode back to town. The following Sunday, Caleb did something he had not done in 3 years. He hitched the wagon dressed in his cleanest shirt and told Clara they were going to church. She looked at him from across the kitchen table, her hands around a cup of coffee that had gone cold. You don't have to do this, I know. They'll stare. Let them. They rode into Elkhorn with the children in the back of the wagon, dressed in the best clothes Clara could manage. Elijah's shirt was too big but clean. Nell wore a ribbon in her hair that Clara had fashioned from a scrap of calico. When they pulled up to the small white church, every head on the porch turned. Edna Hargrove stood at the top of the steps, her face pale, with a fury so controlled it looked like piety. Caleb climbed down, walked around the wagon, and offered Clara his hand. She took it. He placed his other hand on the small of her back and guided her up the steps past Edna through the door. Not a word was spoken, but every person in that building understood the message. She is here. With me. That is all you need to know. Inside, Nell held Caleb's hand through the entire service. Elijah sat straight, eyes forward, his jaw set with a determination that looked borrowed from his mother. Clara did not bow her head. Edna watched them leave from the church steps, her eyes narrow. Her gloved hands clenched at her sides. She was already planning her next move. The night after church, a wolf came down from the ridgeline. Clara heard the goats first, a sound of pure panic, high-pitched and rhythmic, cutting through the dark like a blade. Caleb had gone to check the south fence line where a section had collapsed under ice. He was not back yet. Clara grabbed the pitchfork from beside the door and ran to the barn, in her bare feet, the frozen earth biting into her soles with every step. She threw open the barn door and saw it, a gray shape, low and lean, crouched in the straw near the goat pen. Its eyes caught the moonlight, through the slats, 2 pale coins floating in the dark. She did not scream. She did not freeze. She drove the pitchfork forward and shouted a sound that was not a word, but something older, something that came from the same place inside her that had carried 2 children across 3 states. The wolf flinched, snarled, then turned and slipped through the gap in the barn wall it had forced open, vanishing into the night like smoke. 1 goat had been bitten. A shallow wound on the foreleg, bleeding but not deep. Clara knelt in the straw, washed the wound with water from the trough, tore a strip from her own underskirt, and bandaged it tight. She checked the other animals, closed the gap in the wall with a board and 3 bent nails. Then she sat on the barn step with the pitchfork across her knees, breathing hard, and waited. When Caleb rode in 20 minutes later, he found her sitting exactly like that, bare feet tucked under her skirt, pitchfork in hand, face calm. He looked at the blood on her hands, at the bandaged goat standing steady in its pen, at the board nailed across the gap. He did not say thank you. He said something better. You should keep the short rifle in the barn from now on. It was the first time he had spoken to her, not as a guest, not as a woman he had taken in from the cold, but as a partner. But at that same hour, 5 miles west, in Elkhorn, Edna Hargrove sat at her writing desk by the light of a kerosene lamp. She dipped her pen and began a letter. Dear Mr. Bell, she wrote, I am writing to inform you that the 2 children of your late brother Henry Whitfield are currently residing in most troubling conditions in Montana Territory. She wrote steadily, filling both sides of the paper. She knew Warren Bell's address because 3 months before Clara ever set foot in Elkhorn, a well-dressed man from Denver had come to town asking questions. Not about children, about land. Henry Whitfield's land. He had visited Pruitt's Mercantile. He had taken tea with Edna at the parsonage. He had left his card. Evan. Edna sealed the letter, addressed it to Denver, Colorado, and set it on the table for the Morning Post. The letter would take 2 weeks to arrive. And when it did, everything Clara Whitfield had built through sweat and sleepless nights and sheer refusal to surrender would be placed on a scale against money and law and the cold machinery of a man who wanted nothing but what lay beneath the frozen ground. But Clara did not know that yet. She was sitting by the fire, reading her husband's old letters by candlelight, tracing each word with her finger. The shapes of his handwriting were becoming as familiar to her as the sound of his voice had once been. She could almost feel him in the ink, almost hear him in the way the letters pressed into the page. She was learning to read, and without knowing it, she was building the only weapon that would matter when the time came. Beside her, Caleb sat with a cup of cold coffee, watching the fire. Nell was asleep in his lap, her small hand curled around his thumb. Elijah lay on a pile of quilts near the hearth, his breathing slow and even. Outside, the wind picked up. It rattled the windows like an old ghost trying to get in. But the house held firm. The letter arrived on a Tuesday. A rider from town, bundled in furs and leaning against the wind, brought it to the gate and handed it to Caleb with a muttered apology, as if the paper itself carried something contagious. Clara stood frozen at the threshold of the house, flour dusting her apron, one hand braced against the doorframe. She watched Caleb take the envelope, turn it over once, and walk to the far side of the porch to read it. He did not bring it inside. She watched from the doorway. His back was to her, broad, and still his shoulders set against the cold the way they always were. But something changed as he read. A tension gathered along the line of his jaw, a tightening she had learned to recognize over the past weeks. It was the same look he wore when a fence post snapped in the frost, or when the mule threw a shoe on frozen ground. The look of a man calculating the weight of a problem. When he came back inside, his face gave away nothing. It's from your husband's brother, he said. Warren Bell. In Denver now. Says he only just heard about Henry. Wants the children. The air in the room went solid. Clara felt the words enter her body the way cold enters bone. Slow, deep, settling into a place where it would not leave. No. Caleb folded the paper along its crease, slow and deliberate. Says he has a place for them. Work. A school for the boy. He never wrote. Clara's voice was flat, the kind of flat that comes just before breaking. Never came, not once in 8 months, not when Henry was sick, not when they took everything, not when we had nowhere to sleep. I figured. She moved to the hearth, arms crossed tight. Firelight threw flickers across her face and lit the tension in her jaw, the white ridges of her knuckles where her fingers gripped her elbows. I won't send them. I know. That night, after Elijah and Nell had curled beneath the quilt and their breathing had gone slow, and even Caleb sat across from Clara at the table and told her something she did not expect. I asked Doc Harding about Warren Bell, he said. Doc remembers. 3 months before you arrived in Elkhorn, a man came to town, well-dressed, gloves, polished boots. He went to Pruitt's Mercantile and asked about land, Henry Whitfield's land. Wanted to know where it was registered, how many acres, whether anyone had filed a claim against it. Caleb paused. He didn't ask a single question about the children. Clara stared at him. What land? We lost everything. Henry had 80 acres registered in the county land office, north of Elkhorn, past the timber line. It's in his name. Still is. Caleb leaned forward, forearms on the table, his voice low and steady. The Northern Pacific Railroad is set to extend a spur line through that exact stretch of ground come summer. When it does, the value of those 80 acres will multiply tenfold. Maybe more. The fire popped. A log shifted and sent sparks spiraling upward. Clara understood immediately. She did not need Caleb to spell it out. The arithmetic was simple and brutal. Henry was dead. The children were his legal heirs. If Warren Bell gained custody of those children, he would control their inheritance until they came of age. He did not want Elijah and Nell. He wanted what lay beneath their feet. He wants my children, so he can take the land, Clara said. Her voice was quiet. Quiet the way a river is quiet before it tears through a dam. He'll try, Caleb said. Clara looked at the quilt in the corner where her children slept. Two small shapes rising and falling with each breath. She looked at the fire, at the table scarred with years of another man's living, at the man sitting across from her, watching her with steady brown eyes that asked for nothing and promised nothing except the truth. Then I need to know everything about the law in Montana Territory, she said. Everything about guardianship. Everything about land claims and inheritance. Caleb studied her face. Clara, I can help. I can talk to the judge. I can hire someone. No. She shook her head once firm. I need to understand it myself. I need to be able to read it. All of it. She met his eyes. Teach me faster. If you have ever watched someone learn to read as an adult, you know it is nothing like watching a child sound out letters on a schoolroom slate. It is slower, harder, more humbling. The letters do not come easily to hands that have spent decades gripping hoe handles and washboards and the reins of frightened horses. The eyes resist. The mind, so sharp in other ways, stumbles over the gap between sound and symbol, as if crossing a frozen creek on stones that will not hold still. But Clara Whitfield did not stumble for long. From that night forward, the lessons at the kitchen table changed. They were no longer about the alphabet or simple words from the thin book with the cracked spine. Now Caleb spread out land documents, county records, legal language dense as thicket. He read them aloud first, then had Clara trace each word with her finger, sounding it out, learning its meaning. She memorized the shape of legal terms the way she had memorized the shape of Henry's handwriting. Slowly, completely. With the stubbornness of a woman who understood that knowledge was the only wall between her children and the man who wanted to take them. And every night after the law papers were put away, she brought out Henry's 3 letters and read them again. Each time with more fluency. Each time noticing something new. She noticed things now that she had not before. The pressure behind certain words, as if Henry had leaned into them the way a man leans into wind. The rhythm of his hand across the page quick and certain, the penmanship of a man who trusted what he had to say. Each letter she read brought him back in ways she had not expected, not as memory but as knowledge. She was building something in those quiet hours by candlelight. A kind of armor made not of steel or leather, but of letters and ink and the stubborn, painstaking refusal to remain ignorant. She did not know yet what it would be used for. She only knew that she would never again stand helpless before a document she could not read, and she would never again let a man with a pen take what belonged to her children. Caleb rode into Elkhorn the following week. He did not tell Clara where he was going. He said only that he needed feed for the mule, and she did not press. But when he reached town, he did not go to the feed store first. He went to Pruitt's Mercantile. Margaret Pruitt was alone behind the counter, sorting bolts of cloth with the mechanical efficiency of a woman who has done the same task 10,000 times. She looked up when the bell rang, and her face shifted not with hostility, but with the uneasy recognition of someone who knows she is about to be asked a difficult question. Mrs. Pruitt, Caleb said. He set his hat on the counter. I need to ask you something, and I need the truth. Margaret's hands stopped moving. What about the man who came to Elkhorn 3 months ago, well-dressed, asking about Henry Whitfield's land? Caleb watched her face. Who sent him here? Margaret looked down at the cloth in her hands. She smoothed a wrinkle that was not there. Then she spoke, and her voice was low, as if the walls themselves might repeat what she said. He came into the store first, asked about the Whitfield property, acreage, registration, whether anyone had filed against it. I told him what I knew, which wasn't much. She paused. Then he asked who in town might know more about the family. I pointed him to Doc Harding. But Edna Hargrove was here that day. She overheard. She introduced herself and invited him to tea at the parsonage. And then he spent 2 hours with her. When he left, he gave her his card, an address in Denver. Margaret finally looked up. His name was Warren Bell. Caleb let the silence sit for a moment. And the letter that was sent to Bell last month, telling him about the children, about Clara. Margaret's face drained of color. How did you know about that? Who wrote it, Mrs. Pruitt? Edna. The name came out like a stone dropped into still water. Edna Hargrove wrote it. I saw her working on it at the parsonage writing desk when I went to deliver her flower order. 2 pages both sides. She sealed it and addressed it to Denver. Caleb picked up his hat. Why? Margaret looked at him for a long time. You know why, Caleb. Her boy Russell wanted your land 2 years back. You turned him down. If you lose your homestead because you can't prove you have a family to sustain it, that land goes back on the market. Edna wants Clara gone, not just for the sake of propriety. She swallowed. For the dirt under your feet. Caleb put his hat on and turned toward the door. Mr. Drummond? Margaret's voice stopped him. I signed the letter she sent to Sheriff Briggs, the one asking for an investigation into Mrs. Whitfield. Her hands were clasped tight on the counter. I shouldn't have. I knew it was wrong when I did it. He looked at her, said nothing, then walked out into the cold. That evening by the fire, he told Clara everything. About Warren Bell's visit 3 months before she arrived. About Edna Hargrove's letter. About the connection between the social venom in Elkhorn and the legal threat from Denver. About Edna's son Russell and the land. Clara listened without interrupting. When he finished, her face was still as carved wood. So she sold us to Warren to get your land for her son, Clara said. That's about the shape of it. Clara stood and walked to the window. Outside, the moon hung low over the ridge, turning the snow to pale blue glass. Her reflection stared back at her from the frosted pane. Thin, sharp, harder than it had been 2 months ago. I could leave, she said. Take the children. Go before Warren arrives. You wouldn't be involved. Caleb looked at her. Where would you go? I don't know, but I won't drag you into this. You're not dragging me into anything. His voice was calm, as level as the horizon line. I've been in this since the night I carried your children through that door. She turned from the window. The firelight caught her eyes, and what he saw there was not fear. It was the fierce, controlled burn of someone who has decided to stop running. Then we face this together, she said. He nodded. Together. She sat back down at the table, pulled the land documents toward her, and began to read. Slowly, carefully, sounding out the words that would determine whether her children stayed or were taken. And Caleb sat beside her patient, as the earth correcting gently when she stumbled, waiting when she paused, saying nothing when she got it right, because he knew she did not need praise. She needed practice. Outside, Nell's voice drifted from the rec room where Elijah was reading to her from the seed catalog, his own reading, halting but proud. The girl giggled at something, and the sound came through the wall like sunlight through a crack. The next morning, while Caleb was mending a split fence post in the south pasture, Elijah came and worked beside him without being asked. They drove the post into the earth together, packed it firm with gravel and ash, and strung new wire along the line. The boy worked quietly, his thin arms straining, but never stopping. When they paused to drink water from the canteen, Elijah looked up at Caleb with his father's eyes and asked, Am I yours now? Caleb did not answer right away. He looked at the boy, sun in his eyes, dirt under his nails, wind pulling at a shirt 2 sizes too large. A child who had grown up too fast because the world had given him no choice. You've been mine since the snow, Caleb said. The boy nodded as if he had known it all along and only needed to hear it spoken. That same afternoon, Nell climbed into Caleb's lap on the porch and said in her small, clear voice, Pa, can I feed the chickens? Caleb went still. Clara, standing in the doorway behind them, felt the word pass through her like an electric current. Pa. 2 letters, 1 syllable. A universe contained inside it. Caleb looked down at the girl. Her face was open and certain, the way only a child's can be. She was not asking permission to use the word. She was telling him what he was. Sure, he said. His voice was steady, but Clara saw the way his hand tightened on the arm of the chair, the way he blinked once hard. Let's go feed them together. Clara watched them walk to the chicken coop, the tall man and the small girl, their shadows stretched long across the snow. She pressed her palm against the doorframe and breathed in slow. She was not ready to name what she felt, but she knew it was growing, and she knew it was dangerous, because hope for Clara Whitfield had always been the most dangerous thing of all. The blizzard came 3 days after the letter, not the ordinary snow of a Montana winter, the kind that falls in thick curtains and covers the world in quiet white. This was something else entirely. A whiteout. The sky and the ground merged into a single wall of screaming wind and ice. Visibility dropped to nothing. The temperature plunged to a depth that killed livestock in their stalls and froze water in the pipes solid as iron. They kept to the cabin. The first day passed in the slow rhythm of survival. Feed the fire, melt snow for water, check the animals, patch what needed patching. The children played in the back room with twine and buttons and whatever scraps they could find. On the second night, Nell began to cough. Not the dry rasp she had carried since sleeping outside the mercantile. This was something deeper, wetter, a sound that came from the bottom of her lungs, thick and bubbling like water, in a place where water should not be. Her forehead burned beneath Clara's hand. Her eyes went glassy and unfocused. Her small chest rose and fell in quick, shallow beats that had no rhythm to them. Clara gathered the girl against her body, pressing Nell's burning cheek to her own shoulder, and felt the terror return. The same terror she had known the night Henry died. Cold, precise, a blade that cuts without warning and does not stop. She needs a doctor, Caleb said. He was already pulling on his coat. You can't go out in this. Clara's voice cracked on the last word. You can't see 10 feet. The horse will founder in the drifts. Caleb looked at Nell. Her face was gray. Her lips had a bluish tint that Clara recognized from the old country doctor's warnings back in Illinois. The color of lungs filling with what should not fill them. I'll be back, he said. And then he was gone. The door slammed behind him and the wind rushed in like a living thing, howling and clawing before Clara threw her weight against the frame and sealed it shut. She turned back to the room. Elijah was standing in the doorway of the back room, his eyes wide, his face white. He looked at his sister in Clara's arms. He looked at the door where Caleb had disappeared into the storm. He did not cry. He went to the basin, filled a cup with water, tore a strip from the cleanest cloth he could find, soaked it, and brought it to his mother. He placed the wet cloth on Nell's forehead without being asked. Clara looked at her son, 9 years old, thin as a blade of winter grass, hands shaking but moving, a boy who had already learned that the world does not wait for you to be ready. She spoke to Nell through the hours that followed. She talked about spring, about the wildflowers that would push up through the mud when the snow finally broke, about the sunflower she planned to plant beside the front step, about the chickens Nell would help feed and the baby goats that would be born in March, and the loft that Caleb was going to clear out so Elijah could have a proper place to study. She talked until her voice was raw, and then she talked more. Because silence in that cabin with the wind screaming outside and her daughter burning in her arms felt like surrender. And Clara Whitfield did not surrender. 3 hours. That was how long Caleb was gone. 3 hours that stretched and bent and folded in on themselves until time lost all meaning, and there was nothing in the world except the sound of Nell's labored breathing and the howl of the storm, and Clara's voice steady and cracking and steady again, holding the dark at bay with nothing but words. Then the door burst open. Caleb came through it like a man pulled from a river. His face was dark red, almost purple from the cold. Ice had formed in his beard and along the brim of his hat. His hands were shaking so badly he could barely close the door behind him. But behind him stood Doc Samuel Harding, 60 years old, his medical bag over one shoulder, snow-caked to his eyebrows, breathing like a man who had just outrun death and was not sure death had stopped following. Doc Harding knelt beside Nell. His hands were cold but sure. He listened to her chest with an instrument he warmed first against his own skin. He looked into her eyes. He felt her pulse. Pneumonia, he said. Both lungs, but the left is worse. He opened his bag and began working. Medicines, poultices, instructions delivered in the calm, methodical voice of one who has fought this enemy before and knows its ways. 2 days will tell. She's stronger than she looks, but she needs constant watch. Keep her warm, keep her drinking. Don't let the fever climb past a certain point, or we lose the battle. Clara nodded. Her face was stone. Doc Harding looked at Caleb, who stood by the door, hands hanging at his sides, his knuckles white from the cold and from something else. You rode through that, Doc said, nodding toward the window where the storm still raged. Caleb said nothing, but Clara saw his hands, saw the way they trembled, from cold and from something deeper. The first time she had ever seen him afraid. 2 nights Clara did not sleep. Caleb took shifts beside Nell's bed without being asked. When Clara's body began to fail, her eyes blurring, her hands losing grip, he sat beside her and said quietly, "Sleep, I'll watch." "I can't." "You can't help her if you fall." She looked at him, red-eyed, unshaven, steady as the ground beneath a mountain. She leaned her head against his shoulder and slept for 2 hours. When she woke, his hand was still resting on her back, light and warm, and Nell's fever had broken. The girl's eyes opened the next morning. Cloudy at first, then slowly clearing, like ice melting from a window pane. She looked up at Clara and whispered, "Mama, I'm thirsty." Clara wept, just 2 tears that slid down her cheeks and fell onto the quilt. She wiped them with the back of her hand, filled a cup and held it to her daughter's lips. Nell recovered slowly. Color returned to her cheeks over the following days. The cough diminished from a deep, wet rattle to a dry bark, then to nothing. Within a week, she was chasing chickens again, shrieking and muddy, her hair wild. But news of the illness had already left the ranch. And news in a small Montana town travels the way fire travels through dry grass. Fast. In every direction. Without mercy. The second letter arrived not at the ranch, but at the sheriff's office. Warren Bell had written directly to Sheriff Tom Briggs, requesting a formal investigation into the dangerous and neglectful conditions in which the minor children of the late Henry Whitfield were being housed. The letter cited specific details. Children found sleeping outdoors in freezing temperatures, residents with an unrelated male with no legal standing, and now a child suffering pneumonia due to willful negligence and inadequate shelter. Sheriff Briggs rode out to the ranch a second time. He stood on the porch with his hat in his hands and looked genuinely uncomfortable. "House is warm," he said, looking around. "Children look fed. The girl's recovering. I can see that for myself." He paused. "But Bell has a lawyer, Mrs. Whitfield, and the lawyer has filed papers, a petition for guardianship. Hearing's been set at the county courthouse." Clara felt the ground shift beneath her feet. She stood perfectly still, her face composed, her hands folded at her waist. But inside, something cracked along a fault line she had been holding together with will alone. "When?" she asked. "First week of March, Judge Crawford presiding." After Briggs left, Clara sat at the kitchen table for a long time without moving. Caleb stood near the stove, arms crossed, waiting. He had learned by now that Clara needed silence before she needed words. Then Margaret Pruitt arrived. She came in a buggy alone, wrapped in a heavy wool coat with a scarf pulled high against the cold. She did not come to the front door. She came around the side of the house to the kitchen entrance, as if she did not want to be seen from the road. "I need to speak with you," she said to Caleb. Then she looked at Clara. "Both of you." They brought her inside, gave her coffee. She held the cup, but did not drink. "I signed that letter," Margaret said, "the one Edna sent to the sheriff asking for the investigation. I signed it because Edna asked, and because I was afraid of what she'd say about me if I didn't." She set the cup down. Her hands were trembling. "And I knew about the letter she wrote to Warren Bell. I saw her writing it at the parsonage. 2 pages both sides. She sealed it and addressed it to Denver." Clara watched the older woman with eyes that gave nothing away. "Why are you telling us now?" Clara asked. Margaret looked at her. "Because Doc Harding told me what happened during the blizzard. How you sat with your girl for 2 days without sleeping. How Caleb rode through the worst storm in 10 years to bring the doctor back." Her voice wavered. "I've lived in this town 30 years. I've seen women lose children to fever and cold and plain bad luck. I know what a mother who doesn't care looks like. And you are not it." She straightened in her chair. "I'll testify. At the hearing, I'll tell the judge about Warren Bell's visit 3 months ago, about how he asked about land, not children, and about Edna's letter." Clara said nothing for a long moment. Then she said, "Thank you, Mrs. Pruitt." Margaret nodded, pulled her scarf up, and left the way she had come. The days narrowed toward the hearing, the way a river narrows before a falls. Clara read every night by candlelight, her lips moving silently over legal documents Caleb had obtained from the county office. She practiced speaking her thoughts aloud, testing the weight of each sentence, refining her arguments, the way a blacksmith refines a blade. She was not eloquent, she was not polished, but she was precise, and she was honest. And she knew with the certainty of a woman who had lost everything once and rebuilt it with bare hands exactly what she was willing to fight for. Doc Harding agreed to testify about Nell's condition. The pneumonia had been caused by a prolonged exposure to cold before Clara arrived at Caleb's ranch, not after. The child's recovery under Clara's care had been remarkable. His medical opinion was clear and unambiguous. Sheriff Briggs provided his report from both visits. No evidence of neglect, no evidence of danger. A clean home, fed children, a mother who worked from dawn until dark. But it was the letters that Clara carried closest. Henry's 3 letters, folded and soft from being read so many times that the paper had gone thin as cloth. She could read them now, every word, every line. She could close her eyes and write his name from memory, every stroke, every angle, every habit of hand that made Henry's writing his alone and no one else's. She did not yet know how important that knowledge would be. Warren Bell arrived in Elkhorn on a Thursday. His wagon crested the hill just past noon, new and clean, with wheels too smooth for the rutted tracks that pass for roads in Montana territory. 2 men sat on the bench. Warren Bell in a charcoal suit and leather gloves, his hair oiled, his chin freshly shaved. Beside him sat a deputy from a neighboring county, a man Warren had brought along like a piece of furniture useful for the impression it made. They drove straight to the ranch. Clara was standing on the porch when the wagon came into view. She had seen it from half a mile away, the dark shape moving against the white expanse of snow, and she had known immediately what it was. She wiped her hands on her apron, untied it, folded it, and set it on the railing. Then she placed one hand on the doorframe and waited. Caleb came to stand beside her. He had been splitting wood by the stump, and the axe was still in his hand. He set it down head against the porch rail and stood with his arms at his side. "You want to go inside?" he asked. "No," Clara said. "I want to see his face." The wagon rolled to a stop. Warren Bell stepped down first. His boots barely sank in the snow. He was 40 years old and looked like a man who had never missed a meal or a mirror. He surveyed the property with undisguised contempt, his eyes moving from the patched roof to the weathered barn to the thin trail of smoke from the chimney. Then he produced a smile, tight, polished, the kind of smile that has been practiced in a mirror for an audience that does not exist. "You must be Clara," he said. "I'm Warren Bell, Henry's brother. I've come for the children." Clara did not offer her hand. She did not move from the porch. "I know who you are," she said. "It's what Henry would have wanted." Clara stepped down one stair. Her voice was level, each word placed with the care of someone setting stones in a wall. "You did not come when Henry was sick. You did not come when we lost the house. You did not write a single word in 8 months. And now you stand here and tell me you know what Henry would have wanted." Warren's smile held, but something shifted behind his eyes. "Circumstances change. I have the means to care for them now, a proper home, a school for the boy." "You have the means to take their land," Clara said. The smile vanished. The deputy cleared his throat. "Ma'am, Mr. Bell has legal papers regarding guardianship." Clara looked at the deputy, then at Warren. Her voice did not waver. "Those papers were filed with the court. Then let the court decide. I will not put my children in a wagon with a stranger." Warren looked past Clara to Caleb. "And who are you in all this?" Caleb's voice came out even unhurried, flat as a planed board. "The man standing between you and those children." Warren turned to the deputy. "Do your job." But the deputy hesitated. He looked at the window of the house where 2 small faces were pressed against the glass. Elijah's hand was on Nell's shoulder. The chimney was smoking. The warmth from inside reached all the way to the yard. "I think the courthouse is the right place to settle this," the deputy said quietly. "I'm not pulling children out of a warm house." Warren stood in the yard for a long moment. His jaw worked like a man chewing on something he could not swallow. Then he turned without a word, climbed back onto the wagon, and snapped the reins. The wheels bit into the snow, and the wagon rolled away, growing smaller against the white landscape until it disappeared over the hill. Clara watched until it was gone. Then she went inside and sat at the table and said nothing for a very long time. That night after the children slept, Clara found Caleb on the porch. The sky had cleared. Stars spread across the dark like scattered salt, and the moon threw silver over every surface, making the snow look like something from a world that had not yet been touched by anything ugly. "You're afraid," he said. It was not a question. "Yes." She stood beside him close enough that their shoulders nearly touched. "But I'm more afraid of losing them than I am of any courtroom." "You won't lose them." "You don't know that for certain." Caleb was quiet. The wind moved across the field, low and steady, carrying the smell of cold earth and distance. "I know you," he said, "and that's enough." Clara looked at him, moonlight on his face, the lines deeper in the cold, the stubble dark along his jaw. A man who had lost a wife and a child and a brother in the space of 2 years and had continued to rise every morning and feed the animals and mend the fences because he did not know any other way to stay alive. "I don't want to leave," she said. "No matter what he writes, no matter what he does, I want to stay here." Caleb stepped closer to her. "Then you stay. And if he makes trouble, then I'll make it back." She laughed. The sound surprised her, escaping before she could stop it, and she covered her mouth with her hand. But Caleb smiled, just enough to soften the hard lines of his face into something that looked for just a moment like peace. That night, after she tucked the children in and pressed her lips to their foreheads, Clara lingered by the hearth. Caleb was already stretched out on the rug near the fire, a folded blanket beneath him, one arm behind his head. She stood over him. "You're not sleeping out here tonight," she said. He opened one eye. "That's so." She did not answer. She turned and walked down the short hallway toward the back room. He followed, quiet as snow falling on open ground. No grand promises, no confessions. Just shared breath and shared warmth in the hush of a winter that had tested everything they had and found it somehow still standing. Outside, the storm had passed, the sky was clear, and somewhere in Denver, Warren Bell was packing his legal papers into a leather case and buying a train ticket to Montana. The hearing was 3 days away. If this story has touched your heart, subscribe now and stay with us. Because what comes next is the moment that changes everything. The morning of the hearing broke hard and bright over Elkhorn, the kind of winter sun that offers light but no warmth. It threw itself across the snow in blinding sheets, turning every drift into a field of shattered glass. The sky was pale blue and merciless, scrubbed clean by the storms that had passed through the week before, and the air was so cold it burned the inside of the nostrils with every breath. Clara rose before dawn. She had not slept. She had lain in the dark beside Caleb, listening to the slow draw of his breathing, feeling the warmth of his arm along hers and staring at the ceiling, with eyes that refused to close. Every argument she had practiced, every sentence she had shaped and reshaped in her mind, every word she had learned to read over those long winter nights by candlelight, all of it turned and turned inside her skull like a wheel that would not stop. She washed her face in the basin, brushed and braided her hair, put on the cleanest dress she owned, the one she had mended 3 times since arriving in Montana, the seams straight and the patches invisible unless you knew where to look. She rolled the sleeves to her elbows because that was how she worked, and she wanted the judge to see her hands. Calloused, cracked at the knuckles, stained with the evidence of labor that no amount of scrubbing could remove. She wanted him to see the hands of a woman who had kept 2 children alive through a winter that tried its best to kill them. She reached into the pocket of her coat and felt the 3 letters. Henry's letters. Folded soft from months of handling, the paper thinned almost to nothing along the creases. She did not need to read them anymore. She knew every word, every curve and line and flourish of his handwriting. She pressed them against her chest for a moment, then slipped them back into the pocket and walked into the kitchen. Caleb was already dressed. His beard was trimmed close to the jaw, his shirt clean, his boots brushed. He stood by the stove with 2 cups of coffee, and when she entered, he held one out without a word. She took it. Their fingers touched on the tin. "The children?" she asked. "Mrs. Dawson from the next homestead is coming to sit with them. She'll be here within the hour." Clara nodded. She looked out the window at the white fields, the fence line running straight toward the south ridge, the barn where she had driven off the wolf with a pitchfork and nothing else. "I'm ready," she said. Caleb studied her face. Whatever he saw there, he did not question it. He simply nodded, set down his cup, and went to hitch the wagon. On the ride into town, Clara read the road signs aloud. It was something she had begun doing in the last few weeks, not for practice anymore, but because the act of reading words in the open air of speaking them into the cold morning made her feel solid, real, present in a world that had spent the better part of a year trying to erase her. Elkhorn, 3 miles. Her lips moved around the words. Caleb heard but said nothing. He kept his eyes on the road, and if his jaw was set tighter than usual, if his hands gripped the reins with more force than the horse required, he did not let it show. The county courthouse was a single-story building at the end of Elkhorn's Main Street. Built of rough-cut timber with a sagging porch and an American flag on a pole that leaned 12 degrees to the east, it looked less like a hall of justice and more like a place where men settled debts over whiskey. But inside the room had been arranged with a formality that made Clara's stomach tighten. A long table at the front for the judge, two smaller tables facing it, one on each side, rows of wooden chairs behind already filling with the people of Elkhorn, drawn by curiosity and the particular hunger that small towns develop when someone else's misery becomes public business. Judge Harlan Crawford sat behind the front table. He was 58 years old with a face that looked like it had been carved from the same wood as the courthouse walls, deep lines around his mouth, gray hair cropped short, eyes that missed nothing and revealed nothing. He was the same judge who had warned Caleb 2 years ago about the homestead requirement, the same judge who would now decide whether Clara's children stayed or went. Warren Bell sat at the table on the right. His lawyer from Denver occupied the chair beside him, a man in a three-piece suit with papers stacked in neat piles and a leather portfolio open at his elbow. The lawyer's name was Aldrich, and he had the smooth, unhurried manner of someone who has won enough cases to confuse confidence with certainty. Warren himself sat with his back straight and his chin up, the picture of composed authority. He looked around the room the way a man looks at a property he intends to purchase. Clara sat at the table on the left, alone. Caleb sat directly behind her in the first row of chairs, close enough that she could feel his presence without turning around. She had told him the night before that she did not want a lawyer speaking for her. She did not want anyone speaking for her. This was her fight, her children, her words. Margaret Pruitt sat in the third row, hands clenched tight on her lap, her face unreadable. Doc Harding was in the fourth row, his medical bag on the floor beside his boots. And in the second row on Warren's side, Edna Hargrove sat with her spine rigid and her gloved hands folded, wearing the expression of someone who has already decided how the story ends. The room was full, every chair occupied. Men standing along the walls with their hats in their hands. Women gathered near the back, whispering behind their fingers. The whole town had come to watch. Judge Crawford called the room to order. The sound of his gavel striking the table silenced every voice. Aldrich Warren's lawyer rose first. He buttoned his coat and addressed the judge with the practiced ease of a man accustomed to speaking in rooms where his words carried weight. His argument was simple and delivered with precision. Clara Whitfield was a widow of no financial means. She possessed no property, no income, no formal education. She could not until recently read her own name. She was residing with a man to whom she was not married in a dwelling that was remote, under-resourced, and unsuitable for the rearing of young children. The younger child had contracted pneumonia during her mother's care, a fact which spoke directly to the question of competence. Warren Bell, by contrast, was a man of established means in Denver. He was the brother of the children's deceased father. He had a home, a business, and the resources to provide education, stability, and a future that the current arrangement simply could not offer. "This is not a matter of sentiment," Aldrich said, turning to face the gallery with a measured gesture. "This is a matter of practical reality. A widow who cannot read living on the charity of a bachelor rancher in the middle of Montana Territory is not an environment in which children can thrive. Mr. Bell offers them what every child deserves: safety, opportunity, a proper home." He sat down. The room was silent. Judge Crawford turned to Clara. "Mrs. Whitfield, you have chosen to represent yourself. Do you wish to speak?" Clara stood. Her chair scraped against the wooden floor, and the sound seemed louder than it should have been, as if the room itself were holding its breath. Caleb leaned forward in his seat behind her. She felt the shift of his weight, the quiet gravity of his attention. She placed one hand on the table to steady herself. Then she stepped out from behind it and stood before the judge. Her voice trembled at first, just slightly, a vibration at the edges of her words like a wire pulled taut in the wind. But with each sentence, the trembling diminished, replaced by something harder. Something that had been forged over months of cold nights and early mornings and the slow, painstaking labor of learning to read by candlelight. Your Honor, that I could not read when my husband died. That is true. It is the reason I lost everything. I could not read the debt papers they brought to my door, so I could not argue when they told me I owed more than Henry ever borrowed. I could not read the contracts they put in front of me, so I signed away my wagon, my tools, my horse, and my home without understanding a single word. I could not read, and because I could not read, men with better education and worse intentions took everything I had. She paused, drew a breath. The room was absolutely still. But I can read now. She let that sentence sit in the air for a moment, the way a nail sits in wood before the hammer drives it home. I learned this winter, by candlelight, at a kitchen table in a house that was warm because a good man kept the fire burning. I learned my letters one at a time, the same way I learned to mend fence and dress a wound and drive a wolf from the barn with a pitchfork in the dark. I learned because I understood that the only reason I lost my children's home was ignorance, and I refused to let ignorance take anything else from me. She looked directly at Warren Bell. He did not flinch, but his jaw tightened. Warren Bell did not write to us when Henry was sick. He did not send money when we were put out of our home. He did not ask after the children in 8 months. Not once. He came to Elkhorn 3 months before I arrived here, and when he came, he did not ask about Elijah or Nell. He asked about land. A murmur rippled through the gallery. Judge Crawford's gaze moved to Warren, then back to Clara. Henry had 80 acres registered in the county land office north of this town. I did not know about those acres because I could not read the documents. Warren Bell knew about them because he came here specifically to investigate their value. The Northern Pacific Railroad intends to extend a spur line through that property. When it does, the land will be worth 10 times what it is today. And under Montana territory law, if Warren Bell gains custody of Henry's children, he controls their inheritance until they come of age. Clara's voice was steady now. Clear the way. Water is clear when you can see all the way to the bottom. He does not want my children, Your Honor. He wants what is underneath their feet. Warren's lawyer rose. Objection. The petitioner's motives are not on trial here. The question is the welfare of the children. Judge Crawford looked at Aldrich over the rims of his spectacles. In a custody hearing in my courtroom, Mr. Aldrich, the motives of the petitioner are always relevant. Sit down. Aldrich sat. Clara called her first witness. Margaret Pruitt walked to the front of the room with the careful steps of a woman crossing a frozen pond. She sat in the witness chair and folded her hands in her lap, and when she spoke, her voice was low but carried to every corner. In September of last year, a well-dressed man came into my store. He asked about Henry Whitfield's land, how many acres, where it was registered, whether there were any liens or competing claims. He did not ask about the Whitfield children. He did not ask whether Henry's widow was alive or dead. He asked about dirt and acreage and nothing else. She paused, and then she said the thing that split the room open. The man who introduced himself to me was Warren Bell, and the person who connected him to this town, who invited him to tea at the parsonage and provided him with every piece of information he needed, was Edna Hargrove. The murmur in the gallery became something louder. Heads turned toward Edna. She sat frozen in her chair, her face draining of color so quickly it looked as though someone had pulled a plug. Margaret was not finished. Mrs. Hargrove also wrote the letter that summoned Mr. Bell back to Elkhorn after Mrs. Whitfield arrived. I saw her writing it at the parsonage desk. 2 pages both sides addressed to Denver. And the reason she did it was not concern for the children. Margaret looked at Edna. Her voice did not waver. Her son Russell wanted to purchase Mr. Drummond's land 2 years ago. Mr. Drummond refused. If Mr. Drummond lost his homestead claim because he could not prove he had a family to sustain it, that land would be available again. Mrs. Hargrove wanted Mrs. Whitfield gone, not for the sake of decency, for the sake of property. Edna shot to her feet. That is a lie. That woman is a liar and a gossip, and she has no right to stand there and slander me in front of this entire town. Judge Crawford struck his gavel so hard the water glass on his table jumped. You will sit down, Mrs. Hargrove, or I will have the sheriff remove you. Edna sat, but the damage was done. Every face in the room had turned toward her, and what they saw was not the righteous guardian of Elkhorn's moral standards. What they saw was a woman caught in a light she had not expected. Doc Samuel Harding took the witness chair next. He spoke with the plain, unhurried authority of a man who has delivered babies and closed the eyes of the dead and everything in between for 40 years. The child, Nell Whitfield, contracted pneumonia in early January, he said. I examined her on the night of the blizzard after Mr. Drummond rode 5 miles through a whiteout storm to bring me to the ranch. The pneumonia was caused by prolonged exposure to cold prior to her arrival at the Drummond property. She had been sleeping outdoors. That was before Mrs. Whitfield came to this ranch, not after. He looked at the judge. Since living under Mrs. Whitfield's care at the Drummond Ranch, the child's health has improved markedly. She has gained weight, her lungs are clear, her color is good. I have treated many cases of child neglect in my career, Your Honor. This is not one of them. These children are well cared for. They are fed. They are warm. They are loved. Judge Crawford made a note on the paper before him. Then he turned to Warren's lawyer. Mr. Aldrich, does your client wish to present further evidence? Aldrich stood. He opened the leather portfolio and removed a single sheet of paper. He carried it to the judge's table with the careful reverence of a man presenting a holy relic. Your Honor, this is a letter written by Henry Whitfield prior to his death. In it, he explicitly grants guardianship of his children to his brother Warren Bell in the event of his passing. It bears Henry Whitfield's signature. He placed the document on the table. Judge Crawford picked it up, examined it, turned it over. The paper was clean and crisp, the handwriting neat, the signature bold at the bottom. The room went quiet in a way that was different from the silences before. This was the silence of a held breath, of a scale tipping. Clara felt the blood drain from her face. She looked at the letter from across the room, at the signature at the bottom. The name Henry Whitfield written in dark ink, clear and confident. Warren Bell leaned back in his chair. For the first time since the hearing began, something close to genuine satisfaction crossed his face. Judge Crawford looked at Clara. Mrs. Whitfield, do you have any response to this document? Clara stood very still. Her heart was hammering so hard she could feel it in her throat, in her wrists, in the tips of her fingers. The room seemed to narrow around her, the walls pressing inward, the faces of the gallery blurring into a single mass of watching eyes. Then she breathed. One slow breath in, one slow breath out. She reached into her coat pocket and felt the 3 letters. Your Honor, she said, and her voice was calm in a way that surprised even her. I would like to examine that document. The judge hesitated, glanced at Aldrich, then nodded. The bailiff brought the letter to Clara's table. She picked it up with both hands. Her fingers were steady. She looked at the signature, and she knew. The way you know the sound of your own child's cry among 100 others. The way you know the creak of your own front door in the dark. She knew Henry's handwriting. She had spent months learning it, tracing every letter with her finger by candlelight, reading and rereading the 3 letters he had written her before they were married. She knew every habit of his hand, every quirk of his pen, the small and particular ways a man leaves himself on paper without knowing it. And this was not him. This is not my husband's signature, Clara said. The room erupted. Warren was on his feet instantly. She cannot read. She admitted it herself. She has no basis to make that claim. Clara did not look at Warren. She looked at the judge. Only the judge. I could not read when my husband died, Your Honor. That is true, but I can read now. And more than that, I have spent this entire winter learning to recognize my husband's handwriting, because his letters were the only things I had left of him. She reached into her pocket and placed the 3 worn letters on the table beside Warren's document, side by side. The paper of Henry's real letters was soft and yellowed with age, creased from months of being carried against her body. The paper of Warren's document was crisp and white, the ink dark and fresh. These are the only letters Henry Whitfield ever wrote to me, Clara said, written in 1875 when he was in Missouri and I was in Illinois, before we were married, before the children. I kept them because they were all I had. She pointed to the first letter. Henry's capital H always has a curl at the top, here. She traced it with her finger. And here, and here. Every H he ever wrote. She moved to the signature on Warren's document. This H has no curl. It is flat at the top, straight. It was written by someone who did not know how Henry formed his letters. She pointed again. Henry's signature always leaned to the right. Always. Every time he signed his name, the letters tilted forward as if they were in a hurry. She held up the real letters. You can see it in all three. She laid Warren's document beside them. This signature leans to the left, the opposite direction. Finally, she pointed to the W in Whitfield. Henry wrote his W with two sharp folds, distinct, angular. You can see it clearly in every letter. She touched the W on the disputed document. This W is rounded, soft, written by a different hand. She looked up at the judge. I am not a handwriting expert, Your Honor. I am a woman who learned to read 5 months ago, but I know my husband's hand the way I know my own children's faces. And the man who signed this document was not Henry Whitfield. The room was silent. This was the silence that comes when something true has been spoken and every person in the room knows it. Judge Crawford held the 4 documents in his hands. He studied them for a long time. His eyes moved back and forth between the signatures, comparing, measuring, weighing. The lines around his mouth deepened. He set the papers down and looked at Warren Bell. Mr. Bell, the judge said, would you care to explain the discrepancies Mrs. Whitfield has identified? Warren opened his mouth, closed it, opened it again. His lawyer placed a hand on his arm, but Warren shook it off. He looked at Clara, and for the first time the polish was gone. What remained was the face of a man who had bet everything on a bluff and watched the table turn. He said nothing. Judge Crawford waited 10 full seconds. Then he picked up his gavel. It is the finding of this court that the document presented by Mr. Warren Bell as evidence of the deceased Henry Whitfield's wishes regarding guardianship bears significant irregularities in the signature consistent with forgery. This document will be forwarded to the territorial authorities for criminal investigation. He struck the gavel once. The petition for custody filed by Mr. Warren Bell is denied. Custody of the minor children, Elijah and Nell Whitfield, shall remain with their mother, Clara Whitfield, who has demonstrated both the capacity and the commitment to provide for their welfare. He struck the gavel a second time. Furthermore, this court notes that the children are residing in safe, stable conditions at the Drummond Ranch under the care of their mother and with the support of Mr. Caleb Drummond, a property holder of good standing in this community. He looked at Warren Bell one final time. Mr. Bell, I would advise you to leave Elkhorn before the results of the forgery investigation are returned. Because if that signature is confirmed as fraudulent, you will face felony charges in the territory of Montana. Warren stood. His face was the color of old ash. He looked around the courtroom, searching for a single sympathetic face, and found none. Even Edna Hargrove would not meet his eyes. He turned, walked up the center aisle between the rows of silent townspeople, pushed through the door, and disappeared into the bright, cold morning. No one spoke for a long moment after he left. Then Sheriff Briggs walked to the front of the room and stood before Edna Hargrove. Mrs. Hargrove, he said, his voice carrying quiet authority, I expect you'll be available if the judge has further questions about your correspondence with Mr. Bell. Edna looked at the faces surrounding her. 30 years of accumulated moral authority crumbled in the silence of people who would not look at her. She stood, gathered her coat, and walked out of the courthouse without a word. The door closed behind her, and the room exhaled. Clara had not moved. She stood behind the small table with Henry's letters still spread before her, her hand resting on the worn paper, her eyes fixed on nothing in particular. The noise of the room faded. The congratulations, the murmured approvals, the shuffling of boots on wood, all of it became distant, muffled, as if heard through water. Then she felt a hand on her shoulder. Warm, steady, the same hand that had pulled her into a wagon in the dark 3 months ago. The same hand that had carried her children through a doorway and into warmth. She placed her own hand on top of his and pressed down. Margaret Pruitt appeared beside her. The older woman's eyes were red. Mrs. Whitfield, she said, anything you need from my store, anytime. No conditions. Clara looked at her. Thank you, Mrs. Pruitt. Doc Harding shook Caleb's hand on the courthouse porch. The old doctor's grip was firm, and he held on for a beat longer than necessary. Sarah would have been proud of you, he said quietly. Caleb swallowed, nodded once, and said nothing because there was nothing to say that the silence did not already hold. They rode home without speaking. The wagon wheels crunched over the frozen road, and the sun was already sliding toward the western ridge, throwing long orange shadows across the snow. In the seat beside her, Caleb held the reins loosely. His eyes on the road, his face settled into a quiet expression she had come to know. Something close to the absence of struggle. The look of a man who has been carrying a weight for a very long time and has just set it down. When they pulled up to the ranch, the children were waiting on the porch. Mrs. Dawson stood behind them in the doorway, one hand on each small shoulder. The moment Nell saw the wagon, she broke free and ran boots, slapping the frozen ground. Arms outstretched, her whole body aimed at Clara like an arrow. Clara dropped from the wagon before it fully stopped. She knelt in the snow and caught her daughter pulling her in tight, pressing her face into the girl's hair. Elijah came more slowly, but when he reached her, his thin arms went around her neck and held on with a strength that surprised them both. "You're safe," Clara whispered into their hair. "You're home." The children did not ask if the man from Denver would come back. They did not need to. The truth of what had happened was written on their mother's face in the steadiness of her hands, in the way she held them without trembling. That evening, as the light faded into deep violet and the first stars appeared over the ridge, Clara stepped out onto the porch. The air was cold but still. The kind of still that comes after a storm has finally spent itself, and the world is too tired to make any more noise. Caleb was by the wood stump splitting logs, sleeves rolled to his elbows, breath fogging with each strike. The axe rose and fell in a rhythm as old as the land itself. Clara walked over. She picked up a worm and set it on the stump. He looked up, sweat on his brow despite the chill, a question in his eyes. "I want to build something," she said. "Something that doesn't get taken away." He nodded once, split the log clean with a single stroke. "Then we build it. I want a fence along the south line. I've got posts for it. I want the chicken coop moved closer to the house so Nell can help." "She'll like that." Clara paused, then said quietly, "And I want a proper place for Elijah to learn. He's ready." Caleb straightened, rested the axe head against the ground. "There's space in the loft. I'll clear it." Clara looked at him. The steady stance, the calloused hands, the way he always waited before speaking, as if every word cost something, and he wanted to make sure he could afford it. She took a breath. "And I want your name." His brow furrowed. "You want what?" She looked him dead in the eye. "You heard me." "Clara, I don't mean for you to think that I expect anything. What happened between us, that was your choice and mine, and it doesn't have to mean a piece of paper or a preacher or any of that if you don't want it to. I don't need a ceremony in town. I don't need a preacher reading off some book." Her voice was firm and clear. "I want it spoken, out loud, between us. I want the children to carry your name. I want them to know this means something, that we chose it, that you chose it." Caleb lowered the axe. He swallowed hard. His throat moved and his eyes went dark with something that was not sadness, but might have been the memory of all the things he had lost in the terrible, unlikely wonder of being offered something again. "You already have it," he said. His voice was barely above a whisper. "I want it said." He stepped toward her. His rough hands found hers and drew them against his chest. He looked down at her, and in the fading light his face held an expression she had never seen on him before. Open, unguarded, as if something locked away for 3 years had finally decided carefully that it was safe to come out. "My name is yours," he said, "if you want it." She nodded once. No tears, no soft collapse, just a single hard, quiet nod. The kind of nod that carries the weight of everything that came before and everything that will come after. Yes. They did not kiss. Not then. But the silence between them filled with something heavier than words, and the wind that moved across the fields seemed for a moment to go still. That night, the boy asked if he could help Caleb with the animals come morning. Caleb tousled his hair and said, "Sun up sharp." Nell had already begun calling the loft her school. Clara tucked them in, pressed her lips to their foreheads, then stood in the doorway long after their breathing slowed, watching the quilt rise and fall in the candlelight. Spring came slow that year, dragging its feet through the last snowdrifts and the frost-bitten grass, reluctant, as a guest who knows the party is over but cannot bring himself to leave. The thaw revealed the bones of the land. Fences collapsed under ice. Footpaths hardened into ridges of frozen mud. Trees split from cold, their wood pale and exposed like broken bone. But spring also brought green, creeping up from under the dead things, pushing through cracks in the earth that had seemed permanent only weeks before. Shoots of wheatgrass, buds on the apple tree, the particular stubborn green of things that refuse to stay buried. Clara rose earlier now, not from fear or habit, but from something she had almost forgotten the shape of. Peace. She liked the hush before sunrise, the quiet scrape of the coffee pot on the stove, the sound of the door swinging open to meet a morning that was cold but carried within it, for the first time in months, the scent of thawing earth. She liked seeing Caleb in the yard, sleeves rolled, boots, half-laced, working without complaint in the pale light. She liked the way he moved through the morning, the way water moves through a familiar channel, finding its own path, not because he was lazy, but because he had done this so many times that his body knew the work before his mind gave the order. The children grew stronger in ways she could see and in ways she could only feel. Elijah had muscle in his arms now. He mended his own shirt cuffs without being asked. He split kindling with a confidence that made Clara's chest ache with something she could only describe as pride sharpened by grief. He looked like Henry sometimes, in the set of his jaw, in the way he squinted into the sun. And Clara would watch him and feel two things at once, the sorrow of what was lost and the fierce burning gratitude for what remained. Nell's hair had been cut short, Caleb's idea, so it wouldn't tangle when she chased the chickens. She had cried at first, holding the fallen strands in her small fists like something precious being taken. But within a day she was running freer than ever, wild and bright as a fox on a hillside, her laughter carrying across the yard in sharp, clear bursts. The loft was a schoolroom now. Caleb had built a desk from scrap wood, planed it smooth with his own hands, and shaped a shelf for the few books they had. Clara taught both children to read first from memory, then letter by letter, word by word, until they could sound out sentences from the Bible and the seed catalog and the land documents that Clara kept in a wooden box beneath the bed. She used everything she had: scraps of cloth to teach numbers, eggs to explain trade, leaves pressed flat between pages to talk about seasons and the way things die and come back. Some afternoons after the chores were done, Caleb sat on the porch steps and listened to the lessons drifting down from the loft. Clara's voice patient and firm, Elijah sounding out a word, Nell repeating it in her high, clear tone. He never interrupted, just sat there, hat off coffee, cooling in his hand, listening the way a man listens to music he thought he would never hear again. One afternoon, Margaret Pruitt drove out to the ranch in her buggy. She brought a bolt of new cloth, blue cotton, with a small white pattern, and set it on the kitchen table without explanation. "For a proper dress," she said, looking at the wall above Clara's head. "If you want it." Clara looked at the cloth, ran her fingers over the weave. "Thank you, Mrs. Pruitt." Margaret nodded and turned to leave, then stopped. "I was wrong about you," she said, still not meeting Clara's eyes. "I was wrong, and I knew I was wrong while I was doing it, and that makes it worse." Clara was quiet for a moment. Then she went to the shelf by the stove, took down a jar of apple preserves she had made from the last of the autumn fruit, and placed it in Margaret's hands. "We're even," she said. Margaret looked at the jar, then at Clara, and for the first time the wall between them was gone. The photograph of Sarah still sat on the shelf above Caleb's bed, but it was no longer face down. Clara had turned it upright one morning while making the bed, setting it beside the books, so the light from the window fell across the young woman's face. Caleb had not said anything about it that day, but that night, lying beside Clara in the dark, he whispered, "She would have liked you." Clara did not answer. She simply found his hand under the blanket and held it in the silence between them, was the kind that does not need to be filled. The preacher came through Elkhorn in late May, riding a tired horse with dust on his boots and a Bible that looked as though it had survived every kind of weather God had thought to send. He was not Edna Hargrove's husband. That man had resigned his post and moved his family to Helena 2 weeks after the hearing, following a conversation with Judge Crawford that was never made public but was widely understood. The new preacher was younger, quieter, and had the kind of smile that suggested he had seen enough of the world to know that kindness mattered more than doctrine. Caleb invited him to stay for supper, over salt pork and beans, and the last of the flatbread Clara had baked that morning. The preacher learned the shape of the household, the rancher who had lost a wife and a child and a brother, the woman who had walked 3 weeks across open country with 2 children and nothing but 3 letters and a scrap of newspaper in her pocket, the boy who was learning to read and mend fences, the girl who fed the chickens every morning and called the rancher Pa. The wedding was not grand. There were no guests beyond the children, no paper invitations, no flowers arranged in crystal vases. Just the four of them standing in the front room of the cabin with the evening light coming through the window and the preacher reading from a book so worn the words had been rubbed half away. Clara wore her best dress patched and clean sleeves rolled to the elbows. Caleb had trimmed his beard and put on the shirt he wore to church. The preacher spoke the words. Clara and Caleb repeated them, their voices steady, their eyes on each other. "I do," she said. "I already did," he answered. They kissed once, short and sure, the way you seal an envelope that holds something valuable. Then they sat down to supper like any other night, Nell chattering about the baby chick she had named Biscuit Elijah, asking whether they could plant corn this year in addition to beans. And something in the room had changed. Some weight lifted, some question answered. The air itself felt different, lighter, like the first warm wind of spring after months of cold. That night, Clara stood in the doorway of the cabin and looked out across the land. The sun had just gone down and the sky was purple and gold and fading, and the fields stretched out before her in every direction, green now, truly green, the kind of green that only comes after a hard winter, when the earth has been given time to rest and remember what it is for. The sunflower she had planted beside the front step was as tall as her waist. Its head was heavy with seeds and tilted slightly toward the west, following the last of the light. She had planted it the week after the hearing, pressing the seed into the cold ground with her thumb, and she had checked it every morning since, watching it push up through the dirt, grow a stem, unfurl its leaves, and finally open into a bloom so bright it looked like a small piece of the sun had fallen and taken root. Behind her in the house, the children were asleep. She could hear their breathing slow and even through the open door. Caleb was in the kitchen washing the supper dishes with the quiet efficiency of a man who has done this task alone for years and does not mind doing it now in the company of someone who does not expect him to change. Clara touched the door frame with her fingertips. The wood was rough beneath her hand, solid, real. She thought about the night she arrived in Elkhorn. 2 children sleeping on a stranger's porch, a jar of stolen lard in her trembling hand, the shame that had burned through her chest like a swallowed coal, and a man's hand extended in the dark, offered without explanation, without condition, without any of the words that make a thing official. She had stared at that hand for a long time before taking it. Now that hand had built fences and desks and shelves for books. It had carried her children through a blizzard and steadied hers while she learned to read. It had rested on her shoulder in a courtroom while she fought for everything she had, and her own hands. The ones that had trembled around a jar of stolen lard. They could read now, they could write, they could hold a forged document before a judge and find the lie hidden in its ink. Caleb came out and stood behind her. He did not speak. He placed his hand on her shoulder, light and warm the way he had on the first night and every night since. Clara looked out across the fields. The wheat grass was coming up in pale green rows. The chickens were settled in their new coop, murmuring in the dusk. The moon was rising above the ridge, full and silver, casting the kind of light that makes even ordinary things look like they matter. "We're home," she said quietly. His hand tightened gently on her shoulder. "We're home." The sunflower swayed once in the evening breeze, its heavy head nodding as if in agreement. Inside the house, the fire burned low and steady. The children breathed in the dark. The walls held firm. And outside, the wind moved across the Montana prairie, warm now, carrying the smell of new grass and turned earth and the distant promise of summer, crossing the empty miles. The way stories cross the years, steady and patient and unwilling to be forgotten.